They did.
Anyway, you'll know always the cricket was on the French Council, Youth Initiative, plus many others we got in David, which I forgot.
Too many things, yeah.
But anyway, over to David. Some person here has heard this already, so it's brilliant that have come back for a second time. But there we are, David, you better keep up the standard.
Great, thank you very much, Ray, and thanks very much, everybody, for giving up your Wednesday evening to come and listen to me. This is going to be expensive when I get to the Navigator, that's the question. Anyway, what I'd like to do this evening, for I think about an hour, Ray, is that what's allowed? You'll time check me if I'm going over. Oh, you'd be surprised. This is the cut down version. I want to talk about the court of King James I of England, James VI of Scotland, in South Cambridgeshire, and the very direct connection to Little Shelford. And I think some of you know, well, let's just introduce myself. Ray's done a very nice, kind introduction. But I live in a thatched cottage next to the terrace on the High Street, within spitting distance of the Navigator. Close enough to the church to be high and holy on Sundays, but near enough to the pub to be debauched on weekdays, so that's all right. And I'm an accountant, not a historian. I'm not a professional historian or anything like that, but I have a real fascination and interest in local history. Moved to Little Shelford in '97, originally lived just opposite here, Church Street. And then I started to explore Little Shelford history in earnest over the last 10 years or so. And you might remember during the first lockdown in the village, we were producing a weekly digest book. And then I started to do quite a lot of research around aspects of village history, wrote a number of articles. But what really intrigued me here is when I started exploring the history of Little Shelford. Oh, should I use this maybe? That's what it's here for. When I started exploring the history of Little Shelford, a few things popped up. I thought that's rather unusual for a small English village. And that led me down the path that led me to discover some pretty unique things about the court of King James I in South Cambridgeshire, which is what I'm going to cover in this talk. So let's start at the beginning. What were the connections that led to this fascination and brought this up? Well, it all started when I read an excellent history of All Saints Church, Little Shelford, which many of you will know. We've got Saxon gravestones. There was a Saxon wooden church probably on the site, and then stone building after the arrival of the Normans and so on. So a very historic church. And Ken had written a really good history. What intrigued me was when I read the history, there was a section on the bells. Okay? And really intriguing was this mention, this is a quote from the book, at the beginning of the 17th century, the number of bells was increased, with a notable addition in 1612. A new bell with the inscription, Richardus Holdfeld, Meath Besset, Henry Worsley, Earl of Southampton, 1612, which translates to, Richard Holdfield made this bell for Henry Worsley, Earl of Southampton, in 1612. So, interesting, what on earth were the Earl of Southampton, whose family seat is in Bewley in Hampshire, the clues in the name, Earl of Southampton, why would he be donating a bell to the Peel in Little Shelford? And the bell captain is here, John Coppendale, and he's still ringing the bell, and the arrow points to the bell that is the bell with the inscription. It was recast, I think, in the 50s or 60s, but they very sensibly kept the casting of the original inscription as well. And we're very lucky to have such a beautiful peal of bells that are still rung on a regular basis in the village. So I was scratching my head, what on earth was this guy doing in Little Shelford? And why would he spend a huge amount of money, by standards of those days, on a bell for All Saints Church? Does anybody here know the answer? You. I'm very glad. If somebody said yes, I would be able to come here and I would quiz them. So we catch them anyway. Okay, very good. So let's find out a bit more about Henry Worsley. It's pronounced Worsley like that. The third Earl of Southampton. So some details. Born in 1573, okay, and died in the Netherlands, aged 51. He was there fighting a war. When his father died, he was only 8, So he inherited the older, but because he comes from a member of one of the most established families in the hierarchical system that existed, of course, in those days, in terms of the aristocracy, actually he had to be put into somebody's charge. It was actually Queen Elizabeth who chooses to whose charge he should be put, or she didn't choose, you know, she was a canny businesswoman, so she actually sold the rights to look after him for £1,097.06 per annum. But there was some deal done, so he originally went to Lord Howard of Effingham, but some deal was done, and he ended up being a charge of Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, who looked after the young girl. William Cecil, you might recall, was Elizabeth I's chief advisor for most of her reign. So he's a pretty influential guy. And I won't bore you with it today, but there are those who speculate that actually the Earl of Southampton was the illegitimate son of Elizabeth I. But it's Americans who think that. So they're probably slightly unhinged in some respects with thinking that. This doesn't seem a particularly well supported theory, but anyway, so it's a side issue. So he went to live in Cecil House, where Lord Burleigh lived. At the age of 12, the first connection with Cambridge, in Cambridgeshire. At the age of 12, he entered St John's College and graduated an MA on the 6th of June, 1589. Okay, I don't suppose he had to get 5 A stars at A level to get in with those hereditary connections. And then he joined the bar in Gray's Inn in 1588. On his 16th birthday, he was, I think the only record was Lord Burleigh noted his age, celebrated his birthday, and some kind of deal was being done by Lord Burleigh to marry him off to his eldest granddaughter, who was the product of Anne Cecil and Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. So another very influential member of the aristocracy in Elizabethan times, Edward de Vere, who, of course, some also think was William Shakespeare. That's also another story. There's lots of interconnections in these stories. Anyway, Henry didn't like the idea of getting married, so when he turned 21, he paid off the de Vere family with 5,000 quid and said no thanks, which is a lot of money in those days, so it kind of disconnected him from that particular marriage. Then his association with the arts suddenly began. When he was 18, Lord Burleigh's clerk in Chancery, John Clapham, dedicated a poem to the third Earl of Southampton, Henry, called Narcissus, recounting the Greek legend of a beautiful young man who perishes through self-love. So you begin to get the impression, and these are all paintings of him, by the way, through different ages. So the first one was the youngest, and then this is the more recent. I think he was 18 at this point, rather golden locks and flowing hair and pale skin. And it was clear from all the records that he was spending a lot of time in Queen Elizabeth's court, so mixing with all the key courtiers in Elizabeth's age. He was in attendance with Queen Elizabeth when recorded that he was in attendance with Queen Elizabeth when the Queen visited Oxford in September 1592 when he was 19, and was praised in a specific poem written by John Sandford to commemorate the Queen's visit to Oxford. And speculation is this is when he first met William Shakespeare. Because William Shakespeare would have been travelling down through Oxford between his home in Stratford and the theatres in London. So that's the speculation. Because just a year later, when Shakespeare was 29, he dedicated his narrative poem Venus and Adonis to Southampton, who was then 20. And then followed in a year later, he dedicated the Rape of Lucretia to the Earl of Southampton as well. And you can read the whole dedication, this is just part of it. The love I dedicate to your lordship is without end. What I have done is yours, what I have to do is yours, being part in all I have, devoted yours. And this, of course, this kind of wording we have to take in the context of the times, but in modern times, of course, everybody has immediately assumed that Shakespeare was having some kind of relationship with the Earl of Southampton, also assisted by the fact that his looks are rather young and boyish or girlish, whatever you want to say about it. But anyway, clearly there was a relationship between the two of them, hopefully platonic or maybe platonic. Sorry, I shouldn't say anything politically incorrect. There was a relationship, and Shakespeare dedicated these key poems to the Earl of Southampton. When he was 28, he was involved in a rebellion against the Queen with Essex, the Earl of Essex, and they were both sentenced to death along with Essex. It really wasn't against the Queen, it was more against her close advisors. And actually, they wanted to get rid of the close advisors, not the Queen. But anyway, it was all regarded as treason. And so he was sentenced to death along with Essex, but then his old friend, Robert Cecil, begged the Queen for mercy, and he was commuted to life imprisonment in the Tower. And this portrait of him is believed to have been painted while he was in the Tower of London. Why do they say that? Because in the background, top right, and I've exploded up here, is the Tower of London as it was at that time. And these words painted on the painting, which is "in chains unconquered." So he was being a bit boastful and saying, "I'm here, but I'm unconquered." And in fact, indication of a close relationship with James I then came about because within 10 or so days of James I becoming King of England and the Queen having died, he was actually released from the Tower. So that's some background on him. It still hasn't answered the question, what was he doing? What was he doing buying a bell in Little Shelford? So let's come on to that. So the bell was given to All Saints in 1612. So there's a brilliant book by Mary Stoops, who wrote this book in the 30s. It's kind of definitive life of the Earl of Shakespeare. And it mentions Little Shelford on a number of occasions. The first occasion that him being here is mentioned is in, as it says here, 1st of September 1606. King James was visiting Newley and staying at the Earl's house with the Earl. And the Earl recounted to the King, remember that the King James, as you'll discover, was a big fan of hunting. He recounted, in his hawking brook at Shellingford, he saw divers fowls upon the river, and a little way up the stream a fox, very busy by the bankside. And it goes on to explain how the fox went about catching many of the ducks in the river. And of course, where he's talking about is the river as it passes round the back of the manor house, as you'll discover as I go through this. So that was the first mention. And then she had to do a lot of research, but then she also subsequently discovered that in the Ely's, in the registers for All Saints Church, which are now kept in Ely of that age, his son, the 4th Earl, was baptised at All Saints on the 2nd of April, 1607. So he was definitely in Little Shelford, in the manor house, in 1607. And then subsequently, 2 of his servants were registered for burial in the All Saints registers in 1608 and 1615. So I doubt if he was here permanently, but on and off, he was living in the manor house for something like 10 or 11 years. Okay, and that picture there is in the Fannywale History of Little Shelford, and is the only known painting of the manor house in Manor Road in its Elizabethan form. It's very difficult to prove it absolutely because there's a shortage of documentary evidence as to exactly what happened when, but another rich local bought Shelford Manor House, not the manor, not the land, just the manor house, and rebuilt it in this fashion. And my speculation is that he rebuilt it in this fashion because the Earl of Southampton wanted to stay here in the grandeur to which he had become accustomed in the court and at Beaulieu. But that's just speculation on my part. So what about the wider local scene? Well, there's some other interesting characters I just want to introduce, and this is the connection also to the Manor House. So this chap, Sir Horatio Pallavicino, an Italian by birth, who died in 1600, but he died at Babraham Hall. So not far from here, Babraham Hall, okay? He was a financier, a political agent, he wheeled and he dealed. He funded a ship to fight on the English side in the Armada. Because he then wasn't naturalised and wasn't a knight, he couldn't actually be the captain of the ship. All the other aristocracy who funded a ship were captains of their ship, so he's only listed as a crew member on his ship. But his painting is in the paintings in the House of Commons, which shows all the members of the aristocracy who paid for ships to fight in the Armada to save us from the Spanish. So he was moving in illustrious circles, and probably because he was one of the richest people in England by the time he bought Babraham Hall. According to tradition, he made all his money by being a papist, being a supporter of the Pope and the Pope's agent in the UK, or in England, collecting the Pope's dues, and that when Henry VIII disconnected us from Rome, he switched sides and kept all the money and didn't send it to the Pope. But this is a scurrilous rumour, apparently. He actually came from a very rich Italian family that actually had the rights to sell the alum produced in Italy on behalf of the Pope. So, and I think Crystal was telling me the family still exists. Yeah, in terms of a very old Italian aristocratic family. Yes, yeah. So he's another interesting character, and he acquired Babraham Hall in 1589. One of the largest landowners in the country. Lots of land around here he built up. In the late 1590s, it would appear, he acquired Little Shelford Manor House, rebuilt it in the grand Italian style. That comes from work by John Layer, a 17th century historian who lived in Shepperton. Sadly, his history was destroyed and torn apart, but large parts of it have been found, recreated, so thank goodness that some of that history has been retained, so we can look and see things like that. And another noticeable connection, I don't think it's there anymore, but in the 1700s, a chap called William Coles was going around all the Cambridgeshire churches noting features of great note, and he noted that in the east window there was a scroll which included the arms of the Pallavicinos, and it's spelled differently, they weren't very good spelling, which was a duck. So, interesting symbol. And something else just to note, his wife, Anne Hoofdman, who was Dutch, and their children created an interesting connection with another long established local aristocratic family. You'll see there's some connection there shortly. So the other notable figure, just to bring to your attention, slightly further away, but still connected in this story, Sir Oliver Cromwell, the landowner, lawyer and politician, who was uncle to the Oliver Cromwell. But obviously the Cromwells themselves were an aristocratic family. He was also educated at Cambridge. But interestingly enough, you'll note, he married a lady called Anne Hoofdman 1 year and 1 day after the death of her husband, so Horatio Pallavicino. Why 1 year and 1 day? Because if she'd have married him earlier, she would have forfeited her rights to all his land and all his money. So, Sir Richard so Oliver Cromwell was a bit profligate, built up a lot of debts, so clearly marrying said Anne Huftman was quite an astute move. He didn't finish at that. He didn't finish there. He also married his daughters off to the sons of Sir Horace Pavalicino as well. So basically, he married himself into large amounts of money. Quite an interesting manoeuvre. And as you can see, he was trying to sell his house to the king to pay off his debts, despite having married into all this money. And basically, he went a bit awry. And then, of course, his was uncle to somebody else quite well known with the same name. So, you're going to see connections between those three families as we move through this story. So the next question is, just answering this question, what's the Earl of Southampton doing in Little Shelford? You should have worked out by now that the Earl of Southampton was very well connected with all the aristocratic families of Queen Elizabeth's time, and indeed, of course, when Queen Elizabeth died, it was the latter part of Queen Elizabeth's life. So when she died and King James took over the throne, he knew many of the people involved in the whole story. First challenge I got when I went to Stapleford was, how can you call this the court of King James I in South Cambridgeshire when Royston is in Hertfordshire? And does anybody know how I can claim that?
Because it used to be in Cambridgeshire.
Absolutely, yes. In fact, that's a modern map of Royston. Melbourne Street, which runs from the A10 towards the Downs. I don't know what they call it.
The Heath.
The Heath, yes, the Heath. And everything south of Melbourne Street was in Cambridgeshire. Okay? Everything north of Melbourne Street was in Hertfordshire. You look puzzled. The map should be upside down. Yes, you're quite right. I should spin it around. That's the north. And as you know, when you show maps, you should show north. So the station is further down Leesworth Street, if you want to picture it. Okay. So that's why I can claim it's the court of King James I in South Cambridgeshire, because in a minute you'll find out where his palace was. Okay. So what do we know about King James I of England and the Six of Scotland? Fascinating character, fascinating parents. Watch Mary Queen of Scots movies. Some of the recent movies, you'll understand his procreation. Everything was rather interesting. Well, not the procreation itself, the connections, all the family connections. So he became King of Scotland from 24th of July 67 and King of England and Ireland from the 24th of March 1603. He was a son of Mary Queen of Scots and her second husband Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and was a great-great-grandson of Henry VII, which is, those connections made him an obvious candidate to become the King of England. He based himself in England from 1603 and only went back to Scotland once after he'd come to England. We should point this out to the Scottish nationalists. Their king came to England and actually wasn't really very interested in going back. You'll find out why soon enough, but anyway. He was a major advocate of full union. In fact, he was trying to achieve full union throughout his life, but never actually achieved the legal union. And he obviously was the king who faced the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. But also, he was a great man of letters. He wrote books, as you can see here. He wrote books on witchcraft, the true law of free monarchies, the Silicon Doron, etc., etc. Treatise on tobacco and how bad it was for you. So an early recognition of how bad smoking was for you. So he was actually a quite studious academic individual, and he loved literature and he loved the arts. So he was also a big sponsor and patron of the theatre. And of course, William Shakespeare, some of William Shakespeare's most famous plays were written under the rule of King James I, not as most people assume, under Queen Elizabeth. So his latter plays, which were the most famous, like Macbeth, were written under the reign of King James I. And of course, famously, he sponsored the translation of the Bible into English, which was the authorised King James Version, which many people still think is the best translation, even to today, of the Bible. So he was called the wisest fool in Christendom, somebody called him that, but I actually think he was a pretty serious, pretty academic, thoughtful king. Anyway, we can get a bit more of a flavour of his life by what happened when he moved from Edinburgh to London to take up his throne as King of England. So that's a modern map showing that if you walked, it would take 125 hours to get from Edinburgh to London, Banking House in London. He, of course, would have been on horses and carriages. Notice that from 1601, Robert Settle was in secret correspondence with James about the accession, because, like today, when the Queen died, it was very important for the monarchy that the accession of the new king happened very quickly and smoothly and wasn't contended. So all sorts of jiggery-pokery was going on when they knew that Queen Elizabeth was dying. But look, Sir Robert Cecil. Who was Sir Robert Cecil? He was looking after the Earl of Southampton, so a very close connection. James was proclaimed king in London, 24th of March. 5th of April, he left Edinburgh, so he was proclaimed in London as the king, but then he was still in Edinburgh, needed to come down to London, arrived in London on the 7th of May, so it took just over a month. Had never been in England before that, and the whole way he was lavishly entertained by the aristocratic houses in which he stayed. And he himself said, "I'm swapping a stony couch, the Scottish throne, for a deep feather bed, the English throne, much richer." And you can get some insights into his character by looking at what the folks were doing to entertain him as he moved down the A1. Okay, rather small writing, but I'll just call out a few of the highlights. There were lots of banquets. He was releasing prisoners, and crowds everywhere were chanting, "God save the King." So when he got to Berwick-upon-Tweed, tremendous salute of cannon, he was gifted a large purse of gold and given a sermon by the Bishop of Durham, and the bells were rung. He went to Widdrington Castle on the 8th of April. He went deer hunting and killed 2 deer. So he liked hunting, he liked money, he liked food, good food, and he liked sermons and connection with the intellectual, which mostly be church-based intellectuals of the day. He went to Newcastle. He was gifted another large purse of gold, had another sermon by the Bishop of Durham, must have been a favourite, and he released prisoners and paid off their debts. But he never released prisoners in prison for murder. He only released prisoners who were in prison for debt, generally, or minor misdemeanors. In Durham, he was entertained by the bishop again and had lots of jests. He then went to York, and guess what? He was given a cup of gold filled with gold. You can just imagine it as he's moving down and accumulating these vast trunks full of gold and silver and gifts. And there was so much wine served that it poured down a conduit in the street all day, and the ordinary folk of the town drank from it, apparently. Maybe a bit of local excess in that reporting. Doncaster, a bit late, well, it is Doncaster. He spent the night in the pub, but that was probably a bit of a riot. Worksop, he went hunting and enjoyed lots of music. Newark, presented with a fair gilt cup and had a cut purse, i.e. a thief, who was thieving from crowds that were gathering to greet him, had him hung on the spot. No trial, authoritarian streak of a monarch. Then Belvoir Castle, more hunting. Stamford, 23rd of April, hare coursing, which gave the king great pleasure. He loved hare coursing. Then Burley, on the 24th of April, where he fell off his horse when he was hunting, presumably, which gave some concern. Then Little Palace, great entertainment, best confectionery in England, presented with a horse and a very rich saddle, and so on. Guess where he went next?
Where does that list of stuff come from?
It comes from, it's all here. It's all here. The procession of magnificent festivities of King James III's royal consort, family and court, collected from numerous original letters. So all of this I've researched while my leg was gammy and I wasn't able to do much else apart from read. So really interesting, all this crazy stuff that went on. Let's keep an eye on the time as well. Yeah. So where did he go to? He went to Hinchinbrook. You remember who lived in Hinchinbrook? Yeah, Sir Oliver Cromwell, who I mentioned earlier. Rather profligate. And you can see from here, he was quite profligate. So half an hour from Hinchinbrook, he was greeted by the Bailiff of Huntingdon, who presented a sword. But who did the king hand the sword to carry in front of him? The newly released Earl of Southampton. There was clearly a close relationship between the Earl of Southampton and King James I. And you'll remember that Henry Cecil had been writing secretly to King James VI of Scotland, suggesting he should become King of England. And it's believed that Southampton also wrote to the king. Similarly, dangerous, high treason while the Queen is still alive. But of course, he was in the Tower writing these letters, probably felt that there wasn't that much to lose. But anyway, interesting connections. So, Sir Oliver Cromwell greeted the king and had 14 days of entertainment. The heads of the University of Cambridge came to visit him at Hinchinbrook, another Cambridge connection. And Sir Oliver presented the king many rich and respectable gifts, including another standing cup of gold, more horses, deep-mouthed hounds for hunting hares, and a variety of hunting dogs. James loved hunting. And he got well rewarded for that, because in 1603, Sir Oliver was made a Knight of the Bath. And then on the 29th of April, the king left for Royston. And there's a recollection of what fun they were having in Hinchinbrook. Never has so much fun been had in Hinchinbrook. He had such entertainment as the like had not been seen in any place before. There was plenty of variety of meats, such diversity of wines, those not riff-raff, but ever the best of the kind. There were open beer houses erected wherein there was no want of bread and beef for the comfort of the poorest creatures. So this was a big knees up, not just for the aristocrats, but for everybody in and around the village of Hinchinbrook. So where did he go next? Well, he went to Royston, received by the High Sheriff of Hertfordshire, by lots of men on horseback. He was getting nearer to London, people were getting more excited, and also gave the king a horse and a rich saddle. And Robert Chester, who owned the Priory at Royston and also Cock and Hatch House, which was in Barkway, I don't think it really exists anymore, but it was there. And the king, we think, probably stayed in Cock and Hatch House, which is what this picture is of, because it would have been more suitable for the king than the Priory itself. And Robert Chester was knighted for all that, so that's also good. And then he later went on to Theobald's, the house of Sir Robert, another house of Sir Robert Cecil, then on to London, arrived on the 7th of May. So that was his first encounter with Royston. He'd never been to Royston before. So why is it, as we're about to discover, did the king take a fancy for Royston, of all places? You would not naturally think that today. Royston, great place, I really want to live there. I don't know, is anybody here that lives in Royston? Okay, I'm safe. So, this was written in 1830, so not that long after. After you quit where the land grows by degrees poorer, the chalk lies nearer and nearer the surface, till you come to the open common fields within a few miles of Royston, which is at the foot of this high poor land, or rather in a dell. the open side of which looks towards the north. It is a common market town, not mean, but having nothing of beauty about it. I didn't write that, this chap wrote that. Anyway, so why on earth did James, as we discover, spend a lot of time in Royston? Well, some key things. Very close to some of his other favourite places. Newmarket, for horse riding and hunting. Theobald's, settled house, further south, but still outside of London. Just a lovely house with a big deer park. Hitchinbrook, where his mate, who was handing him all the goodies, Sir Oliver Cromwell, was hanging out. It was close to Cambridge, and when he was in Royston, he often had academics come to visit, to debate with him in his house in Royston. And of course, it's just a day's ride from London, so actually it's reasonably easy to reach. And he also said, he wrote in a letter, one of the best places he'd seen for hunting of hare through that whole journey south. Esteeming it beyond all places for ye hunting of ye hare, and yet ye hares here were more stout, and ye scents lay better than in any other place. Reported by John Layer, this historian who lived in Shepperton, and was a Cambridgeshire historian in the 17th century. And by the summer of 1604, we see records of the king's preference for Royston. So 21st of September, he was going to Royston with his hunting crew. 27th of September, a warrant of up to £100 issued to the Exchequer for preparing a house at Royston for His Majesty's access. So he had lighted on Royston as a place to have palace stroke hunting lodge because he loved hunting hare and he felt that this area was the closest to London for doing one of his most favourite activities, his favourite activities. So, small beginnings. He first of all, in 1603, hired the Priory Mansion and stayed there for a while to do some hunting. Then he bought two pubs, the Greyhound and the Cock in Neesworth Street, to turn them into a hunting box. So originally the concept was, would it be just a hunting lodge? You'll appreciate kings and queens have small hunting lodges all over England. And then work started to be carried out with acquiring land. Then, to the displeasure of the locals, he put a ring around, 14 miles ring around Royston, and said basically, nobody hunts around here other than me. And watch out if you do, which clearly displeased the locals. But anyway, not a lot you can do about it. Then £4,000, a lot of money in those days, spent on extending the accommodation. And 1610, enormous amount of activity in developing Royston, the palace, and all the things that go with a royal palace. So there you can see warrants for 500 loads of timber, bricks, and other materials for buildings to be carried to the country with all speed. And finally, the king left Royston not long before he died, February the 28th, 1625.
Many of these buildings still exist.
Funny you should say that, just hold on.
Right.
But yes, Royston is actually quite an interesting place, and I would recommend going and having a walk around and looking at all the blue plaques. So the full extent of the king's property in Royston was recorded. This is a view of his palace with those two chimneys, but that's half the size of what it would have been originally, as you'll see shortly. So there were several surveys taken, including one on his death, and another one when the parliamentarians took over, which was the wealth of the Stuart family. And also there's been some brilliant work and research by a chap called Simon Thurley, who some of you might have heard of, who's written a lot of books on palaces and everything else, and he wrote this brilliant book where some of the illustrations I'm using have come from, about palaces of the revolution, so life, death and art of the Stuart court. Really good book. I think his specialism is history of architecture, I believe. And if you walk around Royston today, there are lots and lots of traces of the royal court and the royal palace in Royston. And in fact, you can tell just by the street names. Dog Kennel Lane, because down there the king kept his hunting dogs. Neesworth Street, I doubt that's anything to do with the king's knees. So I'm not sure that's because it had been on the way to Neesworth. But Palace Gardens as well, King James Way. So there's lots of naming hints that there was a palace there. King Street, Prince's Mews. And in fact, in Simon's book, there is a recreation of what the whole palace complex would have looked like. So that's that road I pointed out earlier. So to the right of that, including where the church is, that was Hertfordshire. And then north, heading down towards the station, is the main location for the palace and the palace buildings. And that's in Cambridgeshire. And as you can see in the centre there, the grand house is the palace, of which half is left. They knocked down half of it because, as you can see, it sticks out into Neesworth Street. So as we evolved, traffic became heavier, they took out half of the building, and of course it's no longer owned by the king anyway. And in these buildings around and behind, other vestiges of the court were accommodated and built. So if you look round, you'd start by looking at the palace itself. I'll show you a photo of what's there at the moment. So that's the palace. So yes, not as grand as Whitehall, or not as grand as think of other big royal palaces, but anyway. Yes, Hampton Court, but similar style, but much smaller than Hampton Court. But the guy was not into grandeur. He was not into the faffery and flummery of royal life. He was very much a studious, hunting, fishing guy. So, these are the buildings that are left that have a relationship to the palace and the court during those early years of the 1600s. And if you go and stand in Neesworth Street, next to the Royal Palace, there is a sign in the middle of the road, there's a little island explaining Royston's heritage and the Royal Court's location here and all the royal lodgings. And in fact, that building on the left there, I'm looking south, up Neesworth Street, so the station would be behind me, walking up towards the central crossroads in Royston. On the left, this building is what's left of the palace, the half. And that's why the chimney stacks are on the outside walls, because they would have been in the middle of the house prior to that.
The hunting lodge is still there, isn't it?
Don't call it a hunting lodge. It's definitely a palace from King James' perspective. But some would call that a hunting lodge to its size. But yes, it's still there. That is it.
I'm told it's next to the fish and chip shop.
Correct. That's the fish and chip shop next to it there. And I've got a photograph of that. So there you are, Palace of King James I. See, palace, not hunting lodge. It started as a hunting lodge. Palace. Okay, and that's the house. So that's why it's actually quite nice if it's not pouring with rain to have a wander around. That's the view from the back garden. I managed to get that because the house was sold about 10 years ago. I found the agent's descriptions. And this fireplace is believed to be original, from the original palace. That's the fish and chip shop, which was the king's buttery, where all his meals were cooked. Slate roof now, but you can tell by the gap that it would have been thatched originally, while there's a gap to the palace next door. But that fish and chicken was the king's buttery. I'm not sure the king would be so thrilled by battered chicken. Opposite, just up the road from there, the guardhouse, court of the bodyguard of James I, very untouched. That'd be pretty much, apart from maybe thatch, those that have looked in those days. Further south towards the railway station, so the palace is just on the end there, where the royal servants, the kennels and the stables lived in those houses. His son, King Charles I, when he was Prince of Wales, lived in a house on the site of Lloyd's Bank.
What's the logo signifying a bird?
Oh, no idea. Good question. Is that the crest of the Duke of York? Oh, okay. Good question. I shall research and come back. Upstart Crow, yeah. Oh, there's another crow. Yeah, there's another one.
It's on two before.
David,
Yeah.
you've gone to here.
The answer.
Oh, British crow.
It's such a fun-
Scotland. It's a race of carrier crow. It's a subspecies of the great ones.
Oh,
We don't see them around here anymore.
okay. Worthy research. I've never thought of asking that question. In the Hertfordshire bit, you can venture into that. You can go across there. So in the Hertfordshire bit, there is a house where Lord Monteagle lived, who was in the court of King James, and that's where actually he's the guy who got the letter warning about the gunpowder plot. He got the letter in Royston and went and shared it with the king in Royston. So a little bit of another connection to history, and of course then there's the church in Royston, which was expanded and enlarged during the king's reign to turn it more into a royal chapel, something more fitting for a king to worship in.
It's taken off the roof a few years ago.
Yes, and it had a fire which destroyed it. It's been refurbished. It's been through some hard times. So, King James liked Royston. In fact, you'll see it later. Of all the palaces from the day he became king, the palace where he spent most nights in his life was Royston.
Amazing.
He spent the rest of the time travelling around Theobald's, Whitehall, all the palaces, visiting places like Bewley, but Royston was his favourite. And it was his favourite because of the hunting, and particularly the hunting for large hares. The trouble is, the locals suffered as a result of this. As soon as the king first arrived in 1604, Royston was full of courtiers, ministers, diplomats, huntsmen, and placemen. King James only travelled with a small retinue, 40, which is about 1/3 of Queen Elizabeth I's retinue. So he was quite prudent, but 40. He appointed a master of the harriers in Royston. He appointed principal huntsmen who kept the 20 couples of hounds, so 40 hounds. He had 4 huntsmen in liveries to support the principal huntsman. He had the king hunting horses, and keeper of the king's house was appointed. And Richard Westley appointed keeper of the game near Royston. And Harry Halfine appointed keeper of the king's game for hawking. Oh, here it says 14 on exclusion there, not 15. Anyway, it's quite a big area. Open fields preserved for hares, rabbits, partridges, dotterel, bustards, and plovers, and all kinds of wild fowls. And occupants of arable land must not plough their land in narrow ridges, nor suffer swine to go abroad unringed and root holes to the endangering of his majesty and the prince in hawking and hunting. There are also to be taken down the high bounds between lands, which hinder his majesty's ready passage. So he's basically turning this 15-mile radius into a game park for the entertainment.
Locals can't have anything left to eat.
No, exactly. It must be quite a struggle. In fact, they were not amused. There's some interesting stories about what was going on. So here we are, some examples. Local farmers and residents were expected to provide food and fodder for all the royals. They appealed to the king to pay their expenses, but often fell on deaf ears. So during one hunt, a group of locals hit on an ingenious way of getting the king's attention. They kidnapped his favourite hunting dog, Jowler, which is reported in a letter to the Earl of Shrewsbury in 1604. Jowler went missing but reappeared the next day with a message tied to his collar which read, "Good Mr. Jowler, we pray you speak to the king, for he hears you every day and he does not hear us. Ask that his majesty be pleased to go back to London, or else this countryside will be undone. All our provisions are used up already and we are not able to entertain him any longer." They were not happy. Instead of the king taking note, James laughed the matter off and just carried on hunting. So he thought it was mildly amusing. Other things of note, of course, this was a time of great religious upheaval. David, not long before Henry, 100 years before, and not even that, creation of the Church of England, dissolution of the monasteries, etc., etc. The Puritans on the rise. Obviously, it's not long after this that you have the Civil War and the arrival in power of the Puritans. Anyway, 28 Puritans came to Royston and presented the king in the hunting field the millenary petition. The millenary petition was a list of requests from a group of Puritans to stop the following practices in the Church of England: the signing of the cross during baptism, confirmation, use of the ring in marriage, the requirement of the surplice and cap, the practice of giving men multiple ecclesiastical positions, receiving pay for each. And it's claimed that the petition had 1,000 signatures, and it was carefully worded so as not to be seen as a direct affront to the king, but definitely expressed Puritan distaste regarding the state of the Church of England. And they hoped that with James' religious views, because obviously he came from Scotland, where the whole puritanical view took off some time earlier and continued to rage, that he listened. Many of the Puritans' goals and requests were rebutted, but the petition itself did culminate in the Hampton Court Conference, which led to James commissioning the new translation of the Bible, the King James Version. So the seeds for the creation of the King James Bible happened in a hunting field outside Royston. Whoever knew Royston was so interesting. If only the locals there realised it to know more of it. Other events, the letter notifying Monteagle of the gunpowder plot was delivered, and that started King James, who claimed that he could read between the lines and could see that there was going to be a bombing attempt. The King of Royston negotiates the marriage of his daughter, and the King's favourite, the Earl of Somerset, was arrested in Royston for the murder of Sir Thomas Overbury in the King's chamber at Royston. And when they arrested the Earl of Somerset, the Earl kissed the King's hand, and then the King hung about his neck, slabbering his cheeks and saying, "For God's sake, when shall I see thee again?" Which is why there are also rumours about the sexual taste of King James I. But this was a different era, so who knows? But anyway, and does it really matter? No. A few other bits and pieces. The King got young Cantabrians to come to Royston to perform plays. Could have been Shakespearean plays, we don't know, could have been anything at the time. Fellows of Trinity College came to preach to the King. Sometimes he wasn't very happy with what they were preaching, and so called him in for close examination. And this is in the era of close examination by the King could end up in a... So must be rather nerve-wracking. And he had to make a public recantation before the King. And the King signed the death warrant in Royston of Sir Walter Raleigh, who was in the picture in 1618. So all sorts of things going on. A few more. Agrees for Prince Charles, Duke of Buckingham, to go to Spain, try and get sorted out a marriage with the Infanta, but that didn't come off. Charles came back to Royston to tell the King, but there was great rejoicing all the way because the English didn't want one of their royal family to get married to a Spanish queen. The French ambassador would turn up, trying to negotiate more marriages for Charles. And of specific interest to some of you in the back row there, the first game of golf played by an Englishman in England was played at Royston, because King James I of England, James VI of Scotland, came from Scotland, and where did they start playing golf? Scotland at St Andrews, and his mother played golf up there. So they were playing golf. It was played by George Villiers, the Earl of Buckingham, so the King's favourite, and King James's son Henry and Charles all played golf in Royston. You notice that James I had a son called Henry, who unfortunately died in his youth, which is why we ended up with King Charles I, which they're all very sad about, I'm sure. And then in January and February 1625, where was the king? As he got closer to death, he was in Royston. He still was holding court. He was still having visits. Lots of discourse, but little fruit. Sounds like a discussion with Monsieur Macron. Much discourse, but little fruit. And then in 1625, the king's health deteriorated badly. End of February, he departs for Theobald's, and he died there on March the 27th, so a month later. So the era of the court of King James in South Cambridgeshire was over. And in fact, Charles much preferred going to Newmarket because he was more of a horse racing man than a hunting man. So although Charles did visit Royston, he didn't really use it anywhere near as much, spent more time across at Newmarket and so on. So, final reflections. Everybody around the time. 2 minutes left. My final reflections. So, as I said before, what fascinates me, and this is probably the best portrait of King James I've found, that's in the Palace of Whitehall. You can see in the background through the window. That building behind is the last remaining bit of the Whitehall Palace, which is the banqueting house. Okay, so he spent more nights in Royston than any other of his royal palaces once he ascended to the English throne. It was a perfect retreat for this guy, because if you read his biography, you'll see that he loved hunting. He didn't like stuffiness and the ceremony of the Tudor court, so posing for that painting was probably somewhat painful for him. He loved intellectual debate, hence when he was in Royston, getting access to all these folk from Cambridge, was well read and was himself an author. But it was a very painful infliction on the people of Royston, South Cambridgeshire, and yes, even in North Hertfordshire. But it did shape South Cambridgeshire during that time. I suppose I haven't really answered the key question. I've just thought about this. I haven't answered the key question. So what was the Earl of Southampton doing in Little Shelford? Well, the answer is, of course, that he was a very close friend of King James I, and he loved hunting, so he was a great hunting companion of James I. And of course, he moved in the circles like Pavlicino and Pavlicino's sons, who were in that circle in the last few years of Queen Elizabeth. They were all together. Pavlicino was at court all the time because he financed the Queen. So there were all these connections, and my assumption that when Pavlicino built the Elizabethan manor house, he built it because the Earl of Southampton wanted to be close to the court in Royston, but needed a house of state. And actually, apart from the one that Pavlicino had bought at Abraham, if you look around this area, at the time there were very few really stately homes. And look, even the king had to build his own. So that is the connection. There's still much research to do on my part. I need to look much more closely at who else was living in South Cambridgeshire at the time, were any of the other members of the court choosing to take houses away from the centre of Royston itself. And a final thought, it had to come to this. Records in Saffron Walden show that in December 1605, the king's players, so Shakespeare's players, so Shakespeare and his players, were paid 6 shillings 8 pence for a play in Saffron Walden. Now, how far is it from Saffron Walden to Little Shelford? And do you think he would have popped by to say hello to his most famous patron? So, did Shakespeare visit Little Shelford? We'll probably never be able to prove it. But what I will say is there are enough connections to say there is a high probability that that could have happened. And indeed, King James I, when he was out hunting, may well have come and taken lunch here. But the problem is finding records to prove it from that long time ago is very challenging. But just look at all the connections. A lot of history is about making connections, not just following parallel lines. So that's the end of my presentation.
That's absolutely super.
All of this has been researched from finding copies of long since out of print books and all that kind of stuff. Lots of stuff available on the internet, these out of copyright books that you can download. I've brought some of the material here if you want to have a look at it. But are there any questions?
Very simple one. Are there any gravestones in Little Shelford churchyard?
No. The oldest gravestones in the church at the moment are about 1750, early 1700s, so not quite late enough, unfortunately, except of course the brasses and so on in the church, which are much earlier. They're more like 12th, 13th, 14th century. So no, I'm afraid not. More questions? Oh, I'll move back this way. So, first question.
I've always assumed that Royston got its name because of King James, but if we see from what you said.
No. No, it doesn't mean Kingstown. It would mean Kingstown in the French. But actually, if you read that, History of Royston, it's actually the Rhodes stone that's at the crossroads in the centre of Royston is where it got the name from, because it's the crossroads for the Icknield Way that came through there, which is why there's that famous underground chapel there as well, which is also worth visiting if you know.
That was Royston Cave.
Yeah, Royston Cave, exactly.
Did that figure at all in?
Not in any of the records, no. And in fact, it was buried for a long time and only rediscovered. Yeah. So
was it
when
the Knights Templar or something?
Yeah, something weird like that. So that the king may and his retinue may never have known it was there.
Wondered if you used it as a wine store.
Possibly as a cellar. Yeah. Richard, you had a question.
Yeah, I think it was way back to your mate Southampton, but didn't at some point sort of graduated before age 16.
Yes. He went to Cambridge at the age of 12. So he was quite an intellectual, but I suspect his parenthood got him in quicker. The aristocracy, yes. Here is a man of letters who works at Cambridge and assures in those days they let them in much younger. Yeah.
There are descendants.
There what, sorry?
There are descendants of the Earl of Southampton, aren't there?
Yes, there are descendants of the Earl of
The
Southampton.
Russells and the Montagues.
Yes. That's right. Through his mother's second marriage was to a Montague. Hence the connection with Lord Montague as well. There was another question? Yeah, Sue. There were definitely ladies there because somebody had to do the cleaning. Sorry, that was said in jest. Of course there were ladies, but frankly, no, his wife, Princess Henrietta of Denmark, was not keen on all this hunting and shooting and fishing malarkey. So actually, she stayed in London most of the time. Okay, and had a very odd relationship. I mean, clearly he fathered loads of kids. So there was natural, there was I'm falling into traps again. There was ordinary conception happening between him and Henrietta to produce these children, but he did seem to show very strong affection for male friends, particularly young male friends. One could argue there's a bit of this going on through this whole story because you've got Shakespeare that also had a wife and children, but seems to have been rather affected by this bright young youth of Southampton, who we think they met when Southampton went with the Queen to Oxford. And of course, in the sonnets, they think that the fair-haired youth in the sonnets was the Earl of Southampton.
Did Southampton ever marry?
Yes, he had to marry because if you remember, his son was christened in All Saints. Yes. So maybe they were just freer with their affections in multiple directions at the time. Yeah. Any more questions, or shall we call it a day and have a cup of coffee?
Just one thing, I think you said about Royston acknowledging King James's influence. They've recently, in the last couple of years, changed the names of the schools there.
Yes, they have, you're right, yeah.
From Freeway and Meridian to
Yes.
King James.
King James School. And in fact, if you go up on the heath, there's lots of plaques and signposts. There's that memorial near the rugby pitches there as well. There's a sign in the middle. So they do acknowledge it. All the blue plaques are there. It's just rather a hidden secret. But when the weather's decent, go and wander around Royston. Just looking at these sites. Well, Southampton has. Yeah, he did. Yeah. None of them own as much as Pallavicino, but his son, being typical sons of extremely affluent, you know, a bit like modern day fairy tales with the sons and daughters of billionaires, they've blown the lot within 2 generations. The whole lot have gone.
Not an uncommon story.
So, yeah, anyway, another question.
50-mile exclusion.
The 50-mile exclusion zone.
How close did that come to Little Shelford?
It would have gone past Little Shelford, it would have probably gone up to Trumpington.
Right.
So Little Shelford was in the exclusion zone.
Was that an early national park?
Well, it was a royal hunting park, and in fact, if you look at many of the popular royal palaces from the 12th century onwards, they were doing that kind of thing. And even owners of manors were doing the same thing. You see villages where the village and the church have been, or the village has been moved to allow the building of a wall to create a deer park. So that's why you often find a church next to the manor house, and then the village is half a mile down the road, because the villagers would have been, in medieval times, around the manor house and around the church, but then they decided as they got richer, they wanted a hunting ground, and they shoved the villagers out. Yeah. Enclosures came a lot later. The enclosures, yeah. Anyway, we're finished. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found it interesting. There's coffee and tea. Yeah. No, I'm not a historian. Okay, thank you very much, Ray. Coming from you, that's a compliment. Thank you.
Also, if you haven't already Sarah Penn has got all the copies. If you'd like one, please see Sarah. Thank you very much indeed.